In Ethiopia, the dying may soon begin again. Despite a massive international relief effort, a civil war that only rarely captures our attention is cutting off food supplies to millions of people.
If we don't get food in quickly, then we will see mass starvation, I'm sure of it.
The crucial issue, how to get food across the battle lines while there is still time.
We can still pull this one off, but it is literally a question of days and weeks.
That's our story tonight. Millions were at risk. Little white babies dying of hunger by the thousands would provoke a greater level of outrage. And yet the greatest obstacle in the way of getting food to Ethiopia is not white indifference, but the callousness of black leaders within the Ethiopian government and among the Eritrean rebels. On both sides, the imperative of fighting and winning a civil war have been given greater priority than allowing food to reach the hungry. Here's a report from John Laurence.
A long time ago, it was known as Abyssinia. It is one of the oldest independent nation-states on earth. The ancient Egyptians called it Punt, the land of God. For thousands of years, nature and humankind coexisted in harmony. It is only relatively recently that the balance has been destroyed by men making war. It is war without mercy. Government MiGs, made in the Soviet Union, drop bombs on people and places in northern Ethiopia held by insurgents who have been fighting for independence for as long as 28 years. For all of its air power, the government is losing. But so are civilians. Indiscriminate bombing by Ethiopian government planes has created conditions of war as a way of life and death. But for the passing presence of a Western television news team, this incident, like almost all of the violence in this, the longest continuing war in Africa, would not have been noticed by the outside world. It is in this context of war as a way of life that the impending famine should be seen. Last summer, for the third time in the past 5 years, normal rainfall failed to come. As a result, up to 80% of the food crop withered and died in parts of Eritrea and Tigray provinces. That is where the heaviest fighting of the war is taking place. Already, people are starving. In this village in Tigray province, the last of the peasants' food is gone. The last of their savings are spent. The last of the able-bodied men and boys are leaving to search for food to bring home to their families. They are unlikely to succeed. The women, the children, and the elderly are awaiting death. The international aid community believes there are between 4 and 5 million people in danger of dying.
This is now the critical 6 months that we're entering in. And between now and September, you will see a situation where people who might have saved a small amount of grain last year have now used that up completely. So they are at a very, very critical stage. If we don't get food in quickly, then we will see mass starvation, I'm sure of it.
The international community has mounted a massive effort to save people from starving in Ethiopia. The United States is the biggest donor. 500,000 tons of food have been pledged to meet the emergency. More will be needed, and the world seems ready to help. But because of the war, most of the food cannot be delivered. Heavy fighting in and around the Red Sea port of Massawa recently has cut off the main supply route for the relief effort. Government planes bombed and destroyed much of the 45,000 tons of food that were stored there, enough to feed 2 million people for a month. Some food is reaching the famine area from across the border in Sudan, but it is believed to be only about 1/3 of what is required. A new corridor into the drought region has been opened up from the south as government and rebel troops hold their fire for the first time. But the first convoys through were small in size and may be too little too late.
Our gravest concern is that conceivably as many as 2 million of the 3.5 to 4 million people at risk in that area will not be accessible.
Because the food is not reaching them, significant numbers of people are now leaving their homes and fields, walking long distances across the countryside in search of food. It is called migration, and it is a relief worker's nightmare.
And once people start migrating out of their villages, of course, then they go to camps, and once if we were to set up camps, then of course people die much more quickly because of disease.
5 years ago, during the famine that captured the attention and sympathy of the entire world, the relief agencies were unprepared for the scope of the disaster. More than 500,000 people died, many of them concentrated in disease-ridden feeding camps. This time, the world was ready with a rescue plan. Experts sent out word months ago that people should stay in their villages until food aid came to them. Local officials told them, the foreigners will send us food. But because of the war, for most people, it hasn't happened. Now, reluctantly, food relief agencies are making plans to create feeding camps all over again for as many as 500,000 people. At the same time, the massive international aid program is trying to find a way through the battle lines to deliver the food. It is a race against time.
We can still pull this one off. We are not going to have to live through 84, 85 again. But it is literally a question of days and weeks.
For millions of Ethiopians, like this woman scratching for wild grass seeds, they are unaware of the worldwide relief effort waiting to reach them. All they have is the promise: the foreigners will send us food. John Lawrence for Nightline in London.
Later, we'll be talking with representatives of the warring factions in Ethiopia, but first, when we come back, we'll be joined by two Americans trying to deal with the threat of famine. Andrew Natsios of the State Department's Agency for International Development, and Congressman Tony Hall of Ohio, chairman of the House Select Committee on Hunger.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by U.S. Sprint.
To assess the need for food, he joins us now from Durban, South Africa. We've been having some sound problems from there. I hope he's going to be able to hear me. Ohio Congressman Tony Hall, who's in our Washington bureau, took over the chairmanship of the House Select Committee on Hunger upon the death of former chairman Mickey Leland, who was killed in a plane crash in Ethiopia last August. Mr. Natsios, can you hear me?
Okay.
Mr. Natsios, can you hear me? All right, we'll try and come back to Mr. Natsios a little bit later. Congressman Hall, you're going to have to take up the cudgel. Is the bitterness so great between the forces in Ethiopia that even in the face of the potential of hundreds of thousands of people dying of starvation, there cannot be agreement on getting food to those people?
Well, the bitterness is very deep. They've been fighting for 30 years, but many of us think that there's been some very encouraging signs in the last 10 days. You saw with your own eyes the corridor coming from the southern region of food. It's a trickle of food, but nevertheless, it's a very good sign.
Let me just suggest, while you're talking, we're going to put up a map of the region so that people have a sense of what you're talking about when you're talking about the southern corridor and then the port up in the northeast. So when you're talking about the southern corridor, you're talking about coming in, what, from Sudan?
We're talking about coming in from the port of Assab and trucking it into Dessie and going up into the Wello province up near the Tigrayan province, which is it's not the farther northern province, but nevertheless it serves a significant number of people. But the problem is that it's a very insignificant amount of tonnage that's gotten in thus far. Over the past 10 days, it's been a little bit over 1,000 tons. The region needs 100,000 tons a month, so it's an encouraging sign, but we must build on what we have right there.
Now, what about the port city of Massawa? Now, we heard John Laurence tell us that quite literally tens of thousands of tons of food were bombed and destroyed. That food is desperately needed in that region, of course.
Well, there's no question about that, and we feel that it's very necessary to have that port to move large tonnages of the food to hit the Eritrean population, which numbers about 1.8 million people that are at risk at this particular time.
And why is the food not being permitted through? I mean, what reasons, and we're going to be hearing, as I said earlier, we're going to be hearing from representatives of both the Eritreans and the Ethiopian government in just a couple of minutes. But I'd like to hear from you when the United States says, here's the food, when other countries around the world say, here's the food, just let us bring it in. What are you hearing?
Well, the biggest reason is that the international donors, including us, are willing to bring it in, but the bombing coming from the Ethiopian government of the port of Massawa makes it very difficult. Nobody wants to risk their lives.
And could there not be assurances given that, I mean, there are an awful lot of very courageous and decent people who are prepared to take rather considerable risks if at least the leaders of both sides would give some representation that they're going to secure the area.
Well, this is a very important issue, and this is, in fact, exactly what we're looking for. But the foreign minister of the Ethiopian government said just a couple of days ago that he was intent on not delivering any food to the drought victims until Massawa was taken back by his government. So it leaves the whole situation up in the air. People don't know whether to bring the food in or not bring the food in. Obviously, they could attack tomorrow. They could attack 3 weeks from now. They might never attack. It creates a tremendous strain and problem as to where to take the food. But the food, according to all international donors, most of it, or a good portion of it, must come through that port.
All right, Congressman, if you'll be good enough to stand by, I apologize to Mr. Natsios, who is standing by in Durban, South Africa, where it is now, I guess, about after 6 in the morning, or just after almost 7 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Natsios, can you hear me now? Hello, Mr. Natsios, can you hear me? All right, well, we'll try a little bit later in the program to come back to him. When we return, however, we'll be talking with an envoy from the Ethiopian government and with the representative of one of the main rebel groups in Ethiopia, with U.S. officials. Tesfaye Germazine, who is also with us in Washington, is the deputy representative to the United States and Canada from the Eritrean Peoples Liberation Front. The EPLF has been fighting for independence from Ethiopia for nearly 30 years. Mr. Kebede, the judgment of history is likely to be rather harsh, don't you think, if what happened 5 years ago happens again in your country? How, in good conscience, can either side prevent food from getting through to people who so desperately need it?
Well, I think what prevails in terms of the food situation in Ethiopia today is very much different than was in 84, 85, especially because early warning systems this time had enabled us to launch the appeal on time, and the response from the international community had also come in time.
No, you're quite right, and I don't think there's any question about that. Indeed, John Laurence just reported on the fact that there is now food in place, but he also reported on the fact that your government is preventing it from getting through to the people who need it.
Well, not at all. My government is encouraging that food be delivered to all the affected areas in Ethiopia, be them people in the rebel-held areas or government-controlled areas. They are Ethiopians, and we have a responsibility to ensure that they are properly fed. The delivery question, I think I have carefully heard Congressman Hall, who thinks that the only channel is Massawa. Massawa has always been a supplementary channel, a supplementary route, a supplementary port. The major port in Ethiopia is Asa port, but as regards Massawa, plans for relief delivery were carried out, hopes were built, and we were about to start what was known as the Northern Corridor, which unfortunately was disrupted by rebel behavior in the area.
You mean the rebels captured the port of Massawa, and then your planes came in and bombed hundreds of thousands of tons of food?
Well, it has, I think, a record and history which goes beyond that. It first happened through sea piracy, which the rebels have launched in the Red Sea, whereby ships bringing in relief supplies were captured, were burnt, were attacked. And what we saw in Massawa later is what followed the sea piracy.
I think your point is well taken, at least to this degree, Mr. Kebede, and Mr. Galmazine, I would appreciate if you would respond to it. There is no question but that both sides have been guilty of preventing food from getting through to civilians who are sympathetic to the other side. Are those days finally coming to an end, I guess is what I'm asking.
The question is forwarded for me, apparently, and I guess what we have to say now is the EPLF is ready to facilitate any food delivery and distribution, be it through the port of Massawa, through the port of Port Sudan, and through the port of Assab. And if you see the affected areas, be it in Eritrea or northern Ethiopia, they are more closer to the port of Massawa as opposed to the port of Assab. And if you look at the cost for transportation, transporting food from Assab all the way north through Kombolcha, Dese to Mekelle is astronomically high than transporting it from the Massawa.
Let me see if I can just pick up, and I hope you'll forgive me for interrupting you.
All right.
You have made a rather broad statement, and let me see if it can be matched by the other side. Mr. Kebede, as I understand Mr. Galmazine, he has said that the Eritrean side would facilitate the passage of food through any port. Will your side make the same kind of statement?
Well, as I have said, we had facilitated the passage of food through Massawa. We had facilitated the passage of food through other ports. What we had facilitated has been disrupted because
I think we have to talk about now. Would you facilitate food delivery and distribution through the port of Massawa? That's the point, and not the past. I guess I can talk a lot about the past too. But let's talk about the present and what we can do in order to save the lives of these 5 million people, Eritreans as well as Ethiopians.
Well, I am very sorry. I'm not here for a debate nor a rhetoric. But if we are going to work for the future, we'll have to recall the past. I am saying that to remind our listeners that the disruption of what was planned to carry out through Massawa had caused the concern which we are discussing today.
No, if I may interrupt and if I may set the agenda, what we are here to discuss today is whether, in fact, food, no matter where it is going to be facilitated, whether the passage of that food is going to be facilitated to the civilian population, no matter whether they be on the Ethiopian side or on the Eritrean side. And that, Mr. Kebede, is the question that I'm posing to you. I don't care about any particular port or any particular point of access, but the broader question of whether food is going to be facilitated, the passage of food to civilians who need it.
When what had started through Massawa had fallen, an alternative route had been planned. It has become operational now through Assab by road into northern Wallo and Tigray, and also by air into Eritrea. We have not exhausted that possibility, and lots can be done in terms of relief delivery along this new alternative. Now, the Ethiopian government here is very much concerned about the situation. We would like to see that other possibilities, other viable possibilities, are seriously concerned by all parties who participate in the delivery of the relief.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to take a break. He is currently in Durban, South Africa. Mr. Natsio, sum it up for me as quickly as you can. I know you've only heard bits and pieces of the program.
Well, the problem at this point is unless we have access to both ports, we cannot get enough food in. The Assab route that Mr. Kebede just mentioned, we appreciate very much, and it's going to be helpful, but that port gets enormous amounts of fertilizer in just when the food is due. We hope to get 270,000 tons of food in the next 9 months through that port. We need 600,000 tons. The only way to do that is to open up the port of Massawa, which is under rebel control and is daily being bombed by the Ethiopian Air Force. We've got to get an agreement from the rebels and the government to open up the port of Massawa so we can get the other half of the food necessary to feed these people through before there's a debacle.
Mr. Germazin seemed to be suggesting that as far as the rebels are concerned, they're prepared to open up the port. True?
Yeah,
They are.
we are.
No, Mr. Natsios, please. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mr.
Yes,
Natsios.
that is correct, and they've told us that, and we appreciate that. What we'd also like from the rebels, though, both rebel movements, a guarantee that they are not going to attack the port of Assab. There is a report that they are massing troops, perhaps for an attack on Assab, which would close that corridor. So there are problems on both sides, and if both sides would make this the first priority, it would make the entire relief effort work. If they don't, the entire effort will collapse, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people will die this summer and this fall.
Mr. Natsios, gentlemen.